Welcome to our annual Grief and Loss training as required for all staff by state law. This training is titled Separation, Grief, and Loss. The information provided here will help to develop your capacity to support children and families. Separation, grief, and loss are key areas for understanding children who are in foster care and the role we all play together to support them and each other. The main topics that we will cover during this training are: children who have been in foster care or who are adopted frequently struggle with the impact of separation, loss, and the resulting grief. A child may express loss and grief through difficult behaviors, and the child's loss and grief may interfere with relationship building. We need to support the child by acknowledging and affirming the loss and by using tools and skills to help the child communicate and understand their loss and grief. The separation, grief, and loss theme will cover the following characteristics: self-awareness, self-reflection. Self-awareness is essential for parents who are fostering or adopting children with a history that includes separation and loss, as the child's grief reactions may trigger the parent's own unresolved loss and grief. Empathy and compassion. It is not unusual for children to express feelings of loss and grief in their behavior. They will need you to see what is behind the behavior are often feelings related to their loss and grief. Children will need your support in processing their feelings of loss and grief. Emotionally supportive and nurturing. Children will need you to create an environment where they feel safe to verbalize and process their feelings of loss and grief. Your ability to be empathetic, emotionally supportive, and nurturing will help to create that safe place.
Welcome to the NTDC podcast, Separation, Grief, and Loss. I'm your host, April Dinwiddie. In this episode, we welcome Dr. Gregory Manning, a clinical psychologist based in Orange County, California. Dr. Manning has worked in government, nonprofit organizations, and mental health agencies providing case management services for youth in care. Dr. Manning is also a nationwide trainer and speaker on issues related to mental health, foster care, and juvenile justice. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Manning.
Thank you, April. Great to be with you, and please call me Greg.
Oh, yes, of course. We're going to jump right in on this important topic. As a starting place, can you help our listeners understand how children may experience grief and loss?
First, we need to establish that grief is a normal reaction in response to losses and challenges in our relationships as people. And specifically for children, there are a few basics. First, the experience of loss for children can be very confusing, as they're less likely to comprehend and understand the reasons for a loss, and they may not know why is the person gone or why is their relationship changed. And this can be very challenging for them and lead to very challenging and confusing behaviors. Next, the younger the child, the more likely it is that the grief is to be expressed outwardly. And specifically, we can see them demonstrating a lot of challenging behaviors, such as aggression, defiance, and or withdrawal. Here's an example. So in response to a loss, a child who otherwise is very playful and engaging at school and at home may become very physically aggressive, and they may refuse to do things around the home or in the classroom. And they also may withdraw and not want to play with any friends or not want to be around their family members.
I appreciate you so much for validating that grief is a normal response to loss and some of these challenging behaviors that come from that loss and grief. It seems so basic, but it's really an important starting place. So now, do you think that children and adults experience separation, grief, and loss differently?
I think there's some basic things that are similar because we're all humans, but there's also some very important and critical differences that we need to be aware of. And the similarities can be that a lot of times our feelings may be very similar because there may be sadness, there may be anger. There also may be a loss of feeling, just like feeling numb. I think all of us can experience that. However, the differences can be much more in some of the behaviors and also in the way that the people experience or understand the loss. And the behaviors can be, like I mentioned before, that the children tend to be more externalized. They tend to be more outward about their challenges. If they are not understanding their feelings and their thoughts, they turn into behaviors like aggression and defiance and withdrawal, while as adults tend to be more reserved in their behaviors. Not all the times, but in general. But on the experience side of it, it's largely because of brain development. Children can't really fathom the fact that someone is gone, they're gone forever and not coming back. And I think when they experience that, it goes along with confusion and disbelief, and they can't accept the loss. And so when we're trying to work with them and support them, we get really frustrated because they just don't seem to get it. And I think that's the biggest challenge, is understanding it. One thing also, April, it's important to note that for both children and adults, they'd be more likely to deny that the loss is affecting them, that everything's okay and they just want to move on with life and move on with things without ever addressing the loss. So I think that's important to realize too.
That makes so much sense, Greg. It might seem easier to deny or ignore the loss. Can you talk more specifically about how children experience separation, grief, and loss connected to adoption and foster care?
I think the most important thing to realize that for children experiencing foster care is that most of their losses occur when they are no longer physically connected with the person. For example, when a child is removed from a parent and their family because of abuse or neglect, that's a loss. And I think it can be profound for them, because I think it's a lot of times the problem is that we don't experience or acknowledge that as a loss. I think it's important to realize that for children in foster care, that separation is a huge loss for them.
Is the same true for adoption as well, Greg?
Adoption takes it even to another level, because when a child is adopted, a lot of times they are in a home which people celebrate. Like there's a whole big celebration that, hey, you're in a loving family home, and that you should feel lucky and that you should feel privileged that you're in this loving family home. While they hopefully are in a loving family home, that is a positive experience for them, it doesn't negate the fact that they're not with their family of birth. That is a big challenge for the youth, but also for the caregivers. Because why isn't this child celebrating us? Why isn't this child happy? Well, they may be happy that they're with you, but they still can be sad that they're not with their parents.
Gosh, absolutely. I'm so glad that we have established these basics, and now we can go a little bit deeper into some of the more complicated, sometimes harder to understand elements of grief and loss. There's something known as ambiguous loss. Can you explain what that is and how it relates to children experiencing foster care and adoption?
Ambiguous loss is, in a general sense, is when a loss is experienced by someone without any verification or proof of death. And as a result, there's no certainty that the person will ever come back and return to them, like natural disasters, like earthquakes or floods or fires, where the person is no longer there, but the body is never recovered. So there's not that finality. And when we mentioned earlier about losses related to foster care, these are still very powerful losses, because the physical person, the parent in particular, or the sibling, which is equally powerful, are no longer with the individual. And there may be visits, but it's not that day-to-day rhythm that you get by living with someone on a regular basis. And as a result, the adults in the children's life, whether it be in foster care and or adoption, may not acknowledge that loss is truly there for the child, because the child is no longer being exposed to abuse or neglect. And finally, when they're in foster care, there's this concept that, well, you might return. So they're in a very confusing state. So I think that's that real ambiguous loss concept, is like this child especially is in this throes of loss, and yet everyone around them without the right perspective sees as, hey, you're gaining from all this. Is a huge benefit for you, And then when they start having those behaviors and the problems, they're like, what's your deal? You should be happy.
I remember learning what ambiguous loss was, and it was like a light bulb went off for me as an adopted person. I had this amazing, loving adoptive home. I knew I had a birth mother and a birth father that existed, but I did not know where they were and if they were alive or dead. So I felt the loss, but I didn't know how to talk about it or let my feelings out. So all that you describe here about ambiguous loss is so powerful and poignant. And I think knowing about that can really be helpful to parents.
Absolutely. No, I think April, your personal experience is very common.
Thank you for that. That's appreciated. We cannot talk enough about some of these concepts that aren't talked about enough, right? Which is this idea of the perception of things because they are physically, emotionally, psychologically safer for a child in the adoptive home, the pre-adoptive home, the foster home, that there isn't something else that may be occurring within the emotional, elements of grief, loss, and separation. So I this is reinforced throughout this conversation that we're having, and I think it's so important. So I really appreciate that. When we think about this, what can happen when these kinds of losses are not validated by others?
I think when losses are not validated, it prevents any closure. And I think if we prevent closure from someone who's experienced loss, what we're generating is that they're likely to struggle in terms of their ability to experience and process that grief and loss, that they may be the only ones experiencing it, because if everyone else neglects it, then they're the only ones experiencing it. And as a result, they don't have any resolution or any healing. Also is that they're not given the right to grieve their loss. So they're confused, like, I'm grieving, but I'm not allowed to. And also, without this validation, they're also not provided with the sources of support and or treatment necessary to facilitate a healthy resolution of their grief and loss. And that has a profound effect on all of their relationships, both peers and at school, and especially in the family home that they're in right now.
That makes a lot of sense. Now that we have this as a baseline,
we will now talk about how unresolved separations and ambiguous loss and grief interfere with forming new relationships. The loss experienced by children in foster care or children who have been adopted is different from any other losses because it is ambiguous. This means that the loss is not final or certain like some of the other losses we experience. For instance, the child's parents may be alive and the child may even see them occasionally, but the relationship has changed. The parent may not be available to the child or may be less available. The child may not be sure if the parent will or will not come back into their lives, or if the relationship will ever be the same again. As a result, there is usually no closure, and the loss does not become final. As you heard in Dr. Manning's podcast, when a child is in foster care and separated from their parent or family due to abuse, neglect, or other circumstances, there is often not a clear timeline for return, and the child has no power to affect the outcome. This ambiguity is stressful to the child, who often wishes to be reunified with the parent and experiences feelings of being in limbo. It's important to remember that the feelings connected to ambiguous loss also apply to other children whose earliest connections were lost, even children who were adopted as infants or those being raised in kinship families. Very few adopted children lose their parents to death, and we know that children who were adopted often think and wonder about their parents and family members. They too naturally wonder about the what-ifs. Too often, these children are not given the opportunity to grieve their losses, as their grief is also not recognized. Children grieve in spurts and at expected and unexpected times. Grief often looks different in children than in adults. A child's grief is often expressed in their behaviors. Grief is a normal response to loss, and it is not considered pathological. The general expectation is that grief will lessen over time as the child works through their grief. However, for the child experiencing ambiguous loss, this grief may not be resolved, and it may be ever present and can lead to a variety of physical symptoms and behaviors. Reactions to unresolved grief may appear at unexpected times, such as when a child appears fine one minute and then displays a burst of aggression, or begins crying for no apparent reason. An unexpected trigger or a trigger unknown to the parent might cause a reaction that seems out of place. The role of the parent who is fostering or adopting is to look beyond the behavior, to try to figure out what has caused it, and to use the opportunity to talk with the child about their loss and grief. Some common symptoms of ambiguous loss and unresolved grief are difficulty with transitions or changes, difficulty making decisions or choices, feeling overwhelmed, difficulty coping with normal childhood or adolescent losses and disappointments, feeling stuck, depression and or anxiety, fearful that they will keep losing people and they don't feel safe, learned helplessness or hopelessness, social isolation to protect from loss again, feelings of guilt and shame, anger, confusion about what happened and whether they were to blame, holding on to unhealthy relationships. There may also be trauma and attachment issues that add to the child's situation. The child may feel responsible for the loss, or they may worry about the parents' or a sibling's well-being. When the child holds out hope of being reunited, they cannot grieve the loss because the loss is not fully recognized and or final. The unresolved grief can interfere with the child forming and adjusting to new relationships. This can make the child's time in foster care difficult for everyone, the family, the child, and the caregiver, since the child is not emotionally free to settle into a new family while they're holding out hope of returning to their parent. It is important to remember that children express their loss and grief behaviorally, and this is often misinterpreted by others as the child misbehaving. Children in foster care are often in survival mode with the hope they will return home at the forefront of their thinking. Because they cannot fully acknowledge the loss they are experiencing, they cannot begin to grieve. They may exhibit behaviors that are intended to distance themselves from their foster or kinship family, or even antagonize them in the hope they will be asked to leave and have nowhere to go but home. For example, the child may say things like, "I hate you. You are not my real parent. I wished I never moved into your home." Once a decision is made for the child to move from foster care to adoption, the child must also face the reality that the hope of return to the parent is dashed, adding to the child's loss. This does not mean that the child will stop thinking or grieving the loss of the parent or family. The family will continue to be present psychologically for that child, even if not physically present. If the parent is still alive, there is always a possibility that a reunion will take place in the future. This is especially true for older children who may plan to reunify once they are 18. Therefore, the loss is not final and the hope remains. The child must be helped to recognize the loss and begin the grieving process. It may also be helpful to validate that it's okay for the child to love and care about many people in their lives. New relationships don't mean that old relationships are or were not important. Now, let's give you the opportunity to imagine what it's like for a child to sustain such profound losses. Before we start, take out a piece of blank paper and be ready to write. Imagine you are moving away and that you will never return. The moving truck is outside. You only have a few minutes to pack 10 singular items or people to take with you. Make a list of the 10 singular things or people you will take with you. Please pause the recording while you make your list. Now you find out that the truck is smaller than you thought. You can only take 5 items or people. Remove 5 items or people from your list. Now you find out that the truck is even smaller than you thought. You can only take 2 items or people. Remove 3 more items or people from your list. You just learned that the truck will now take you to a community that is not of your race or culture, and you'll be living with people you don't know anything about. Think about this. How did you feel when you had to start removing things from your truck? Who or what did you not want to let go of? Who or what did you keep at the end? Why did you make those decisions? What did you learn that would help you understand the loss, grief, and separation experienced by children impacted by foster care, adoption, or guardianship? For many of you, you kept a person, a father, mother, spouse, son, or daughter. That is what children lose when they move into foster care or adoption. It is important to remember that children in these situations are not able to choose parents, family members, or pets. They lose what may be the most important thing to them. As human beings, we all experience loss and grief. It's likely that you will be emotionally touched by the many losses of children that you may work with. It is not unusual for the child's losses to bring up some of your own issues with loss and grief. You will need to have good self-awareness regarding the impact that these losses may have on you so that you can be sure it does not strongly interfere with your ability to respond to the child's needs. Your own self-care will be important. Now let's think about the losses for the child who has been adopted or who is in foster or kinship care that may impact the child's sense of security, belonging, and emotions. Think of a word or phrase of an example of a loss that children in foster care, kinship care, and adoption may have experienced. Some of you may have thought about parents, siblings, extended family, friends and pets, belongings, familiar environments, familiar foods, a familiar way of life, favorite items, toys, clothing, celebrations and cultural events, status within their family, their school, with their friends, connection to racial, cultural, or ethnic communities, access to their personal history, including birth and medical information, school records, and records of other milestones, birth order, genetic connection, privacy, self-identity, such as their name. A child's grief and loss is often expressed in their behavior.
Footage provided courtesy of Participant Media, LLC. Copyright 2018, Sabine Films, Inc. All rights reserved. Sydney, 12 years old.
I was in 7 other foster homes before this one.
Sydney and her foster sister listened to music and danced together in their kitchen.
The differences in between this home and the other homes is I used to run away and now I don't run away. I would always throw stuff around at people and just tore down things, and so I just don't do it here anymore.
Ursuline Beavers.
Once a kid is taken from their parent, if they didn't have an issue before, they got one now. And that's what I try to tell some of the social workers. I said, once you took that kid away, they're going to become bitter, they're going to become destructive, they're going to become angry. They're going to have a lot of problem wrong with them because you took them from their comfort zone, from their parents, from their school, from their friends. You took them away and you expect them to be okay with that. They're not.
Footage provided courtesy of Participant Media, LLC. Copyright 2018, Sabine Films, Inc. All rights reserved. Sydney, 12 years old.
I was in 7 other foster homes before this one.
Sydney and her foster sister listened to music and danced together in their kitchen.
The differences in between this home and the other homes is I used to run away and now I don't run away. I would always throw stuff around at people and like just tore down things, and so I just don't do it here anymore.
Ursuline Beavers.
Once a kid is taken from their parent, if they didn't have an issue before, they got one now. And that's what I try to tell some of the social workers. I said, once you took that kid away, they're going to become bitter, they're going to become destructive, they're going to become angry. They're going to have a lot of problem wrong with them because you took them from their comfort zone, from their parents, from their school, from their friends. You took them away and you expect them to be okay with that. They're not.
Children who are grieving are often overwhelmed by feelings they cannot express verbally, but are communicating through their behavior. For instance, you might see any of the behaviors listed on this slide. For some children, talking about their losses and grief is so painful that they are afraid if they revisit the loss again, they will be so sad that they may never emerge from their despair. Working with a mental health professional to support the grief process is a good way to help children feel safe and supported and to help them more safely revisit losses and begin to manage their grief. It is important that we understand that the impact of the loss will change over time and will be processed differently through different developmental stages. Awareness of the loss changes over time so that at each developmental stage the child reconsiders what has been lost and the grieving process continues. Grief and loss need to be honored and addressed many times over the life course. It is not one and done. The age of the child at the time of the loss has some bearing on the way the child will grieve. Children revisit grief differently depending on their developmental stage and as their understanding and thinking about the loss changes. A child who experiences the loss of a parent as an infant or toddler will revisit that loss many times over as their cognitive abilities develop and their understanding of the loss deepens with age. It is also not unusual for feelings connected with loss to be intensely felt during the teen years as the teen works toward their own identity development and new questions and thoughts emerge. For children placed at an older age, it is important to understand the quality of relationships with parents and other important people in their life will be an important factor in the child's feelings and adjustment. The 5 key factors shown on the slide are essential in understanding how a child experiences loss. 1. The child's developmental level. 2. The significance of the people the child is separated from. 3. Whether the separation is temporary or permanent. 4. How the loss was communicated to the child. And 5. The degree of familiarity of the new surroundings. In addition to understanding how children view loss and deal with grief at different developmental stages, we should review the stages of grief that can be expected, not necessarily in order. Children can feel lots of different ways, such as sad, angry, confused, and guilty, all at the same time. Children grieve because they miss the people who are lost to them, regardless of the circumstances. Let's take a moment and remember how the exercise earlier felt. Not being able to take with you the people, places, and things that meant so much to you. Children who come into the child welfare system at a very young age and who cannot yet fully understand loss intellectually, nevertheless experience loss, especially if they have had a positive attachment to their parent or other caregiver. The main developmental tasks of these early ages are establishing trust, making attachments, moving toward autonomy. Separation from primary caregiver may result in losing a basic sense of trust that all adults will meet their needs, lack of trust in the world at large, and delay of the normal development toward autonomy. A child's grief reaction to loss can be overlooked if the new caregiver is not attuned to their behavior. They will often show signs of grief immediately or soon after being moved to a new family, including changes in eating or sleeping patterns, irritability, lethargy, separation anxiety, regression in attained developmental milestones. For instance, if they are toilet trained, they may regress and begin soiling themselves. If they are no longer drinking from a bottle, they may need to be offered a bottle again to be soothed. For infants and toddlers from different ethnic backgrounds, sounds, smells, and visual stimuli can all be very different and strange, contributing to discomfort when an unfamiliar environment is present. Today in child welfare, many infants and young children entering care may be drug affected, have a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or both. These circumstances require special attention and knowledge on the part of the caregivers. Preschoolers, aged 2 to 5 years. At this developmental stage, children have not yet developed an understanding of cause and effect or permanence. Children who join their foster, adoptive, or guardianship family at birth or at a very young age like to hear their story during this developmental stage, whether it is how they came to their foster or adoptive family or how they came to live with their relative. They may enjoy telling their story and can usually repeat it word for word, but at this stage they do not understand the implications of the story. They are often confused about the facts, and they may miss the fact that they were born like everyone else. So this should be emphasized. This is also the time that children become aware of differences, and for children in transracial families, these differences should be discussed in a sensitive and supportive way. Although they may not explicitly understand the losses surrounding their move from their family, children may exhibit behaviors that indicate that they are aware of the losses, such as searching or yearning behaviors, asking strangers if they are their parents, exhibiting anxiety and sadness, becoming fearful of strangers and being clingy, exhibiting depression, having nightmares, having temper tantrums, becoming hyperactive, exhibiting behaviors that needed to be in control of situations. Children who are removed from their families at this age may feel responsible for being removed, blame themselves, and think that if they were only better behaved, they would not have had to move. They may exhibit phobias, such as school phobia. They may act out in destructive and angry ways or feel anxious and depressed. At ages 6 to 12 years, children begin to understand cause and effect and the implications of removal from their family, especially if they are adopted or in a legal guardianship. They begin to understand that they are in a foster, adoptive, or guardianship family because their parents were not able to parent them. Children begin to wonder about their parents, extended family, or culture, but may not talk with their foster or adoptive parents or guardians about their interest, for fear of hurting their feelings. When young children are in relative adoptions or guardianships, their feelings of loss can be exacerbated by the intermittent presence of parents or by negative family attitudes about their parents. Children at this age are often hypersensitive to the attitudes of their adoptive or guardianship families related to their race or culture as they enter the identity development tasks. If removed from their birth parents during these years, they may be worried about them and any siblings with whom they were separated. Unless discussions are openly encouraged, these concerns may go underground, which can have a negative impact on the child's functioning. They may regress in their behavior, feel a loss of control, and blame themselves for the situation. The conversations that foster, adoptive, and guardianship parents have with their children during these years are very important. These conversations should be honest and framed in a way that supports the self-esteem of the child. No matter how positively the conversation is framed, children understand at this age that in child's language, I got given away. They recognize that you don't give away something of value, and it might follow that they wonder, what is wrong with me that they gave me away? Didn't they try hard enough to keep me? It does not help to only tell a child, your mother loved you so much that she wanted a better life for you. It's better to be honest about the circumstances in language appropriate to the child's age. Some behaviors that might be common during these years for any child who was removed from their family include school or learning problems, daydreaming about family members, imagining reunions, fantasizing about how life would be different if they were raised by their birth family. The child might emotionally withdraw from the adoptive family or resource family, or insistently ask questions about their family. Children in transracial or cross-cultural families may adopt stereotypical behaviors associated with their race or culture to test the comfort of their foster, adoptive, or guardianship family, or because they don't have real connections to support a healthy identity related to their race and/or culture. Some children exhibit anger to create distance and avoid the vulnerability of closeness to avoid further pain. Adolescence is a pivotal time in a youth's life. Adolescents are dealing with many questions about their own identity, their story, and anxiety about growing into adulthood. They often have a keen curiosity and need clarification about the story of their separation from their family of origin, and as they move toward adulthood and leaving home, their losses may be triggered. Their emerging identity challenges can trigger grief issues and emotional upheaval. Their anger at their birth parents may manifest in anger toward their adoptive parents, resource parents, or guardians, flouting of rules and engaging in behaviors they expressly know their families would disapprove of. Some teens may become depressed over a breakup or friends moving away, or even high school graduation, all potential triggers of early losses, and in extreme cases they may have suicidal ideation. Some teens deal with loss by turning to risky behaviors like substance abuse, eating disorders, sexual acting out, and even pregnancy, perhaps seeing this as a way of aligning with their birth parents and their story. Some adolescents use pregnancy and parenthood as an opportunity to prove that they love their children more than their parents love them, or to break the pattern of abuse without realizing the significant challenges this creates for them if they haven't resolved their own grief and loss. All of the normal adolescent issues of separation and developing independence are magnified by experiences with grief and loss. Identity formation at this point is critical, whether cultural, gender, or family. Without opportunities to engage in positive identity formation activities, the adolescent will find their own, and when complicated by grief and loss, they often turn to identities that reject both their old family and their current family, challenging the boundaries of their new family in the process.
Separation, Grief, and Loss. Debbie Riley, LCMFT.
Grief in children is very different than grief that we see in adults. You know, most adults will be able to converse about it. You know, I'm feeling really sad today. I'm thinking about today's the anniversary of my mother's death, or, you know, my husband passed away 6 years ago, and, I'm just really having a hard time with it. And so, there's that articulation that one would have around these issues. Our children grieve behaviorally. So an example would be they come home from school, you ask them how the day went, the backpack gets thrown on the floor, they're stomping around, and little did we know that maybe something in the curriculum at school triggered a sense of loss for them. So they're going to act out the loss versus then being able to come and sit down at the table and say, I'm feeling really sad today because today was the day that, the police came into my home and the social worker and I was taken away from my birth parents. An example, again, of how the loss in children kind of presents itself is one day in a classroom, a teacher read a book, Are You My Mother? I mean, it's a book that's often read to first or second graders, and it really triggered this sense of profound loss for this child that had been in foster care and removed several times into different homes. And so the child ran out of the classroom. The teacher was just stunned by why he left abruptly. The guidance counselor was called in. The parents were called. And nobody really understood, what was underneath all of that. That really what happened was that it really, triggered the loss that he had been struggling with. So I think, it's important, again, to understand how children grieve and also how things could trigger unresolved grief and loss. When we think about how we can support our children around these loss and grief issues, I think that we have to sort of be a couple steps ahead of them. So if it's a birthday coming up, or Mother's Day, or Father's Day, or a holiday, or, you might be going to the movies and it might have a theme, around families, I think we just need to think about how that might trigger their feelings of loss and separation and be able to talk about it. Maybe the birthday's coming up. I know that, I've worked with kids before and parents struggling. Why is it that every time we have a birthday, it's a disaster? And the parents never really understood that as we began to think about the birthday and begin to prepare for the birthday, it reminded them of the loss of the birth parent. Who was the mommy whose tummy I grew in? And that's what birthdays are about, the day that we were born. But yet I'm not with those that brought me into the world. And so if parents can begin to talk about it, that, we're going to celebrate your birthday in a couple weeks, and this is what we're planning to do. And I wonder, you might be thinking about your birth mom or your birth dad, and maybe we want to talk about that. Or maybe we would light a special candle on the cake for your birth parent. Something that we can honor. I think the key here is that we can't expect children to forget, and we shouldn't ask them to forget the people that, whether they were psychologically present or actually physically and then separated from, that we still need to honor those connections for them. I think it's important for parents, as we begin to think how you can support the grieving process, is number one, acknowledge that the grief and loss is real and that it's going to be present. The children might not, again, be talking about it, so you want to be really in tune to behaviors and be thinking about, wow, what's underneath some of this acting out or withdrawal or isolation or change in appetite or change in sleeping habits or pulling away from special activities. Could be that your child is grieving. And so you want to be able to talk with them about it. Ask them what they're thinking, what they're feeling. But don't be afraid to bring up the discussion. And I think that's hard because we sometimes live in a world where we think that if we talk about it, it's going to make it worse, from a parental lens, that if we just steer away from it, everything's going to be okay. Like, why would I want to bring up loss? Why would I want to bring up these separations when, in fact, I think it would be better if they didn't think about it, right? And they just moved on. And I think that's probably the worst thing that we can do, is that we need to be able to sit with their sadness, to embrace that, to give them the space of how to be sad. And I think it's also important that we use our own experiences to talk with children. All of us experience some level of loss in our lives, whether it's a pet, a relative, a spouse, in a community, we've experienced something. And I think we need to let them know that we too grieve and this is impacting us and that we're here for them and we could give them strategies. When we think about how children grieve, we've been talking about that they grieve behaviorally, but we also have to understand that children grieve in spurts. So again, different from an adult that could, sit down and have a conversation for an hour around, their feelings of the loss. Children might be able to do little pieces of that work. It might be 3-5 minutes where you'll get some understanding about how they're feeling, and then they say, okay, I want to go out and play basketball, or can we draw a picture, or can I get a snack? And I think it's important that we respect their ability to acknowledge that at that moment in time, but not push it because it becomes really overwhelming. I mean, their little brains and their little minds and their hearts a lot of times can't process it more than a couple minutes at a time. So I guess patience is really important from a parental lens. And I think that also as you interface with helping professionals, you also have to understand that this work, if they're in therapy, is going to take time. It's not going to be addressed just in 1 or 2 sessions. It could take months. I mean, some of the kids that I've worked with, they're still working through this years later. And it also will rear its head developmentally. So it might come up at 3, it might look different at 5, then at 7. In adolescence, the loss often is embedded in a lot of anger and resentment. And then later in life, around key transitions of marriage, the birth of a child, the death of a parent. It's important that we see it through a developmental lens.
For more information, visit ntdcportal.org.
We've talked about grief and loss and how they may be expressed in a child's behavior. Now let's discuss ways to address grief and loss. You must be willing to have conversations that might be difficult with children about grief and loss. You must be willing to start these conversations. Children may be reluctant to talk because it's painful and perhaps because they have not made the connections between what they are feeling and the losses they experienced. Part of the healing process occurs through relationships of feelings of trust and safety are established. Children may also feel disconnected from their experiences, and having conversations about their stories can help to open the door to connecting to their losses and talking about their sadness. If the child has a life book, this can be a helpful tool to assist the child in thinking and talking about their story. It is also important that you are aware of your own grief history and how you might be triggered by discussions about loss and grief. Supporting children in their sadness and pain can raise feelings from your own experiences, even if you thought they were resolved. Your ability to be empathetic and compassionate without becoming caught up in the child or family's pain will enable you to provide the most emotionally supportive and nurturing environment for their expression of grief. Being aware of your own loss and grief history can help you understand where you might have triggers. If you find that you are struggling with your own grief and loss, it may be helpful to seek professional support. We will talk about some tips for helping children deal with loss, which is further expanded upon in the attached article. Help the child identify what was lost. Discuss loss and ambiguity. Redefine family. Give permission to grieve. Be conscious of how special occasions and trigger intense feelings of loss. Birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, Mother's Day, and Father's Day can all bring up difficult or confusing feelings for the child. Some may bring back traumatic memories and others may bring sadness. Taking steps like adding an extra candle on the birthday cake to commemorate the family, or making a point of saying, "I'll bet your parents are thinking about you today," shows that you are aware that the child may be thinking of others who may not be there with them for these special days, and that you can support the child in recognizing them. Be aware of anniversary reactions, especially on days or during seasons when known traumatic events occurred. Keep your expectations realistic. There is no set time frame for grieving losses. Help the child understand that feelings of grief will come and go in different ways over time, and that you will always be a safe person to talk and express feelings with. Understand that we should not expect the child's feelings for those they care about and lost to just disappear. They will be a part of the child's life into adulthood. Model healthy responses to loss. If you suffer a loss, share your feelings openly. Let children see you mourn so they can learn how you express sadness and anger about loss in a healthy way. It is especially helpful for boys to see grown men express their grief openly, giving them permission to openly express their feelings too. Patience and the ability to sit with the child in their grief and to be supported over time will help to build your relationship and allow the child to continue to process their grief. In this section, we'll work on building your skills to address a child's grief and loss. We will work with a case study for this activity. The case study centers on Darren, a 13-year-old boy who was placed first with his grandparents and then entered foster care at age 9 when they could no longer care for him. The case study includes a list of signs and behaviors that could be related to Darren's loss. Pause this slide to read the case study and note all of the behaviors that could be related to Darren's grief and loss issues. Some possible signs that you might have noted to show that Darren is dealing with grief and loss issues were: he is quiet and withdrawn most of the time. He does not want to talk about Mama and Pop. He gets into fights with other children when he feels slighted. He daydreams in class, has difficulty finishing projects, and hands in homework late. He has trouble sleeping. He is anxious in social situations and does not answer questions about himself. Now it is time to wrap up. Before we do, I want to briefly highlight the key points from this theme. Children in the foster care system are likely to experience unresolved grief and ambiguous loss. Children who have been adopted may also experience grief and loss, even children who were adopted at a young age. Grief work takes time and patience. Grieving may change as the child progresses through different developmental stages. Grief and loss are often the underlying causes of behavioral concerns. Grief is normal. Parents can help to lessen grief and loss by honoring the child's grief and loss and by using tools and skills to help the child communicate and understand their loss and grief.